Welcome back to Moto Italia. In the previous episode, we finished by loosely mounting the freshly serviced fork legs into the triple clamps. Today, we're moving to the rear of the bike, installing the swing arm, the monoshock and the Carc unit. We'll also return to the front end to talk everything down to spec, and I'll share a great tip to help you avoid catastrophic failure of the Carc unit. Here you can see the outer race from one of my old swing arm bearings. As you can tell, this bearing hasn't been tightened properly in the past. The vibration has caused visible and even tactile wear marks in the race. These will of course be replaced. You can also see the marks from my somewhat destructive removal method. I use TIG welding to heat and slightly melt the race. When it cools, it shrinks just enough for the bearing race to come loose easily. The first step in installing the new bearings is to pack them full of grease. For this I use an industrial grade, water resistant EP grease. This ensures proper lubrication and long lasting protection against both wear and corrosion. Once the bearings are fully packed with grease, it's time to install the outer races into the frame. I place the races on each side of the frame, ready for installation. Be mindful that the bearing components are paired. Never mix the inner and outer races from the two bearings. To press them in, I use one of the old outer races as a driver. Gently tap the new race into the frame, alternating between sides so it goes in evenly and doesn't get crooked. Take your time here. Precision is key to ensure a proper fit. The same procedure applies on the right side of the bike, but here there's a bit less room to work because the gearbox output shaft is in the way. As the race reaches the bottom of its seat, you'll hear a distinct change in sound. That sharp, solid tone is the confirmation that the race is fully seated against the frame. With both bearing races securely installed and greased, it's time to mount the swing arm back onto the frame. First, I install the rubber boot that sits between the gearbox and the swing arm. This boot is crucial for keeping dirt and moisture away from the drive shaft and universal joint. Next, I grease the swing arm pivot bolt thoroughly using the same industrial waterproof EP grease I used for the bearings. I also apply a generous amount of grease to the bearing preload nut to ensure smooth adjustment later on. Next, I install the bearings into the frame and fill the remaining gap between the bearing and the sealing ring in the frame with grease. This ensures there's no room for water or other contaminants to get in between the bearing and the seal. Now I carefully slide the swing arm into position, making sure not to disturb the freshly packed bearings. Once aligned, I insert the single pivot bolt from the left side and thread it in by hand. When the bolt is seated, I lightly snug it up and then torque it to 60 Newton meters.
Sets in because when it snaps, you have to open the front brake. And then when you grab it again, if you still make the corner, you started too early. Yeah. You have to go. So he goes wide at that moment. And that's the thing. The interesting thing is that
now that the swing arm is securely mounted and torqued to spec, it's time to move on to the Carc unit. First, a small preventive fix to hopefully avoid any future disaster. On some Carc units, there have been reports of the pinion nut coming loose. In the best case, this can cause bearing and gear failure inside the Carc. In the worst case, the rear wheel could lock up while riding. To prevent this, I apply a penetrating grade Loctite to the pinion nut. This should keep it secure and give me peace of mind when the bike is back on the road. First, I start by cleaning the pinion nut in the Carc drive. I've actually had the Carc sitting in a vise overnight with technical alcohol filled to the level just above the nut. Now I'll blow it clean with compressed air, do one last cleaning with brake cleaner, and then blow it full clean with compressed air once more before applying the Loctite 290. I apply the Loctite using a syringe with a long tip, covering the entire thread area thoroughly. Then I let it sit in the vise for 24 hours to cure properly. This is how it looks after application. While the Carc unit is sitting in the vise curing with Loctite, we move on to the rear shock and linkage arms. The linkage system is critical for smooth suspension movement, so proper cleaning, lubrication and assembly here will make a big difference in how the bike feels on the road. We begin by washing the rear shock. Cue the Italian music.
Non più tra i farfalloni amoroso, notte e giorno di torno girando, delle belle turbando al riposo, Narcisetto a dolcino d'amor. Delle belle turbando al riposo, Narcisetto a dolcino d'amor. Non più avrai questi bei panacchini, quel cappello leggero galante, quella chioma, quell'aria brillante, quel vermiglio d'onesco color, quel vermiglio d'onesco color.
Next, we move on to disassembling, cleaning and re-greasing the entire linkage system. Be aware that only one of the bearings has a cage for the rollers. This is the bearing on the single end of the dog bone. This bearing can be fully disassembled by sliding the pin all the way out. For all the other bearings, you need to be very careful. I pull the pin out only halfway, spray the bearing thoroughly with brake cleaner and blow it clean with compressed air to remove old grease and dirt. I do this from both sides to make sure every bit of old grease is removed. I repeat this process if necessary until the bearing is completely clean. Once cleaned, I pack each bearing generously with waterproof grease to ensure smooth operation and long-term protection. And of course, our Italian singer isn't done yet.
Vermiglio d'onesco color, non più avrai quei panacchini, quel cappello, quella chioma, quell'aria brillante. Non più tra i farfalloni amoroso, notte e giorno di torno girando, delle belle turbate.
With all the bearings cleaned and freshly greased, it's time to install the rear shock and linkage arms. I start by positioning the linkage arms back into the frame and loosely inserting the bolts. Remember to install the spacer sleeve that fits into the swing arm on the left side.
Quando al riposo, Narcisetto a dolcino d'amor. Delle belle turbando al riposo, ci settua dolcino d'amor. Fra guerrieri può far bacco, grande stacchi stretto sacco.
Next, I slide the rear shock into place, aligning it with the upper and lower mounting points. Once it's in position, I install the bolts and snug them up by hand. Now it's time to install the drive shaft. I start by applying wheel bearing grease to both spline ends of the drive shaft. This ensures smooth operation and helps prevent premature wear. Next, I slide the drive shaft into the swing arm and carefully jiggle it onto the gearbox output shaft. It's important to push it firmly until you both hear and feel a distinct click as the locking ring snaps into place. With the drive shaft securely fitted, we're ready to move on to installing the Carc unit. I also apply wheel bearing grease to the input shaft splines of the Carc unit. Then I lift the carts into position, carefully jiggle it onto the drive shaft and thread in 2 of the bolts that secure it to the swing arm. Once the first 2 bolts are in place, I stabilise the bike using wooden blocks before threading in the remaining 2 bolts. Before proceeding, I apply aluminium anti-seize paste to all the bolts, including the 2 I've already threaded in, to ensure proper torque and prevent future seizing. When all 4 bolts are in, I torque them down to the correct specification, 50 Newton meters.
That is hard. And really is the opposite. But like I said earlier, you still need to meet these guys that have the same amount of exactly. You have to find something.
But that's always the thing, especially now in kind of spec tire, spec electronics racing, is which is why these things are actually quite good in some ways. Although a lot of people hate spec tires, is that it is down to the rider to find a way of making the most of whatever he's got.
With the Carc unit securely mounted, it's time to tighten the swing arm bearing preload nut. Moto Guzzi specifies that this nut should be tightened to 10 Newton meters, but I found there was far too much play in the bearings at that torque. After some testing, I ended up tightening it to 25 Newton meters, which provided a much more solid feel while still allowing the swing arm to move smoothly. Finally, I secure the nut in place with the locking bolts, tightening them to 10 Newton meters. Now it's time to torque the rear shock and linkage system. I start with the lower bolt on the shock absorber, tightening it to 40 Newton meters. Next, I move on to the upper shock mount, which is tightened to 50 Newton meters. Finally, the 3 remaining bolts in the linkage system are each tightened to 50 Newton meters. With the rear suspension fully torqued down, it's time to move on to the front end and torque the lower triple clamp to the correct specification. I start by inserting all the clamping bolts into the lower triple clamp before adjusting the fork tube height. I set the tubes so that 3 rings are visible above the upper triple clamp. This is 1 step lower than the stock position. This adjustment is highly individual and depends on how you want the bike to handle. We will return to suspension setup and adjustments later in the series. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any future episodes. Once I've set the desired height, I torque all the bolts in the lower triple clamp to 25 Newton meters. When all bolts in a clamp have been torqued, it's important to go over them once more with the same torque, as each bolt affects the clamping force on the others. Now it's time to torque the upper yoke fixing cap. This bolt should be tightened to 100 Newton meters. Once that's secure, I move on to the fork top caps. I couldn't find a specific torque value from Moto Guzzi for these, but I torqued them to 30 Newton meters, which is more than sufficient. Before we can torque these bolts, we first need to set the fork spring preload to maximum. This step is necessary to create enough clearance for the socket to properly fit on the fork top caps. Next we move on to the upper triple clamp, where we tighten the last 2 bolts. Both of these bolts should be torqued to 25 Newton meters. With that done, the fork legs and steering bearings are now completely finished. Now it's finally time to complete the rear assembly. The last step is installing the reaction rod between the frame and the Carc unit. I mount the rod and apply a generous amount of aluminum paste to the threads. Finally, I torque both bolts to 50 Newton meters. With this done, the entire rear assembly is now complete. And that wraps up this episode. We've successfully completed the entire rear assembly, including the swing arm, drive shaft, Carc unit, linkage system and reaction rod. Everything is torqued and ready. In the next episode, we'll move on to installing the airbox, rear fender, and then take a little detour to throw out the old license plate holder and fabricate our own custom tidy tail. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next part of this build series. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay fast, stay classic, stay Italian.